United Nations. In February 1963, a United Nations Special Fund grant of aid to Castro aroused indignation because 40% of the money will come directly from American taxpayers. Indirectly, practically all of it will come out of American pockets. The American public was also outraged by the news of another United Nations agency, UNESCO, which had published a vicious Soviet propaganda booklet, which we paid for. In March 1963, United Nations officials admitted they had been lying about UN operations in the Congo. This bad publicity brought many to realize what many already knew, that our membership in UN organizations which can use our tax money to finance our enemies will lead to disaster. The United Nations Charter is identical in philosophy with the Constitution of the Soviet Union. Bills are now before Congress calling for American withdrawal from the United Nations. That is a summary of my report on United Nations. The full report after a message from my sponsor. The United Nations Special Fund, which gives aid to underdeveloped countries, was created in January 1959. Paul G. Hoffman is managing director. The fund is financed by contributions from member nations. The United States contributes 40% of the grand total. All other nations together contribute the other 60%, although practically all nations making contributions get more than enough direct aid from the United States to offset their contributions to the United Nations Special Fund. Nations receiving aid from the UN Special Fund for projects have to help pay for the projects. Again, these nations get enough direct aid from the United States to offset what they put into UN Special Fund projects. So, in effect, the U.S. virtually finances the whole UN Special Fund operation. In the 1959-1963 period, direct United States contributions to the United Nations Special Fund totaled $100,400,000. Contributions of all communist countries totaled $8,228,000. But communist nations received from the UN fund $10,846,000. The American public paid little attention to this situation, however, until January 1963, when the United Nations Special Fund announced that it had completed arrangements for a gift of $1,157,000 to Castro's Cuba for agricultural experiments. The United States government protested, but the UN Special Fund made the gift anyway. The UN Special Fund is by no means the only United Nations agency giving American tax money to communist nations, but Cuba is such a sore spot that this particular gift by Paul Hoffman's United Nations outfit in January and February 1963 rankled badly. Urged on by outraged constituents, many United States representatives and senators began to question the wisdom of our membership in United Nations organizations, which can use our tax money to subsidize our sworn enemies in open defiance of our protests. United States Representative Durward Hall from Missouri complained so much about the UN gift to Cuba that UN officials told Hall that the United States itself had received aid from the UN fund. Congressman Hall was told that the UN had sent a Chinese expert who taught American rice farmers how to grow fish in rice paddies, the secret being to keep the fish happy. Congressman Hall could not, however, find out where or when this UN Special Fund aid project in the United States occurred. The United Nations Information Center in Washington told him the rice fish project was in Kansas, which has no rice paddies. The New York office of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization told Congressman Hall the project was in Arkansas. Mr. Hall found in a book written by Paul Hoffman a statement that the rice fish project was in Louisiana. Mr. Hall wrote Hoffman to find out where in Louisiana and to get other details. In reply, Mr. Hoffman merely admitted that he had made a regrettable mistake in his book, but he did not tell Congressman Hall what the mistake was or where the rice fish project was. From remarks by officials of the American government and from odds and ends of information supplied by various United Nations officials, Congressman Hall concluded that some Chinese expert had come to the United States to tell rice farmers to keep their fish happy, and that the United States government had paid for the expert services directly. But Mr. Hall never determined when the Chinaman came, where he went, whom he advised, or how much we paid him. In February 1963, American newspapers, which carried stories about the UN Special Fund's gift of American tax money to Castro and about this fish story, also carried stories about a booklet written by Soviet nationals and published by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. The book is pure Soviet propaganda, denouncing race discrimination in the United States and colonialist oppression in the Western world generally, while praising Soviet race relations as one of the major social triumphs of the 20th century. United States taxpayers paid more than 32% of the total cost of that UNESCO Soviet propaganda booklet. Members of Congress and of the press demanded an explanation from the State Department. Department officials said that they had protested with vigor the publication of the Soviet anti-American booklet at American taxpayers' expense, but the United Nations agency ignored the American State Department protest. In March 1963, United Nations officials admitted that the United Nations had been lying about its operations in the Congo. While decent people all over the earth were appalled at the United Nations war to subject the province of Katanga to the rule of the communist-controlled Congolese government, not very many were aware that other provinces of the former Belgian Congo were also trying to exercise self-determination in order to escape domination by the communists in the central government. One such province was South Kasai. Congolese and United Nations armies used the same savage tactics to suppress South Kasai that they used in Katanga. Mission stations and hospitals were ransacked and pillaged. Eyewitnesses told of United Nations-supported Congolese troops pouring gasoline on huts, setting them afire and then shooting down all who tried to escape. Whole villages and towns were destroyed. More than 100,000 South Kasaians who escaped the guns and bayonets of United Nations and Congolese troops fled into the brush to suffer famine. Thus, United States tax money was used by the United Nations to suppress rebellion in the province of South Kasai in the Congo. For 2 months, while this frightful operation was afoot, United Nations officials denied that anything was going on in South Kasai. Then, on March 21st, 1963, United Nations officials in the Congo abruptly admitted that the UN had crushed a rebellion in South Kasai. All of this bad publicity, which the United Nations received in the first 3 months of 1963, provided no new information for Americans who have studied UN operations and who know that American membership in the United Nations will eventually lead to the destruction of our free and independent republic. One specific danger of our membership is that the United Nations provides the cover of diplomatic immunity for communist spies, saboteurs, and secret police agents sent into the United States. Communist agents attached to United Nations delegations from communist countries enter and leave the United States at will. They serve as couriers for the Soviet worldwide espionage network. They bring in tons of propaganda material. They direct espionage and sabotage activities in the United States. The case of 21 Russian sailors in 1956 proved that Soviet secret police, under cover of UN diplomatic representation, operate inside the United States, terrorizing refugees who seek asylum here, openly defying American laws and law enforcement agencies. Since the United Nations was formed, and to guarantee the right of all peoples to choose their own government, one of the bloodiest wars in history has been fought. Communists have conquered vast territories in Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, and have murdered millions of people in the process. And the United Nations has not even protested these communist conquests. The Korean War, called a UN police action, did more for communism in Asia than anything else has ever done. American and South Korean soldiers did virtually all the fighting, and the United States bore practically 100% of the cost. The United Nations acted merely to hamstring and restrict American operations so that our soldiers sent into battle to die could not use their best weapons to destroy the enemy. The Korean War was the worst disaster in American history, with the possible exception of the Civil War. It cost us the lives of over 50,000 American soldiers. It built Red China into a menacing military power. It lost us the respect of all Asia, and it ended on enemy terms as the first war America ever lost, primarily because of the United Nations. As long as we keep trying to do anything in the United Nations, we are headed for ruin because the UN is an international socialist conspiracy whose aim is to produce a socialist one world. The best way to prove this is to examine Chapter 9 of the United Nations Charter and to compare it with Chapter 10 of the Constitution of the Soviet Union. In philosophy, these two are identical. They express the ideal that all powerful government should provide rights and benefits for the people to the limit that government can and feels safe. This ideal of the beneficence of all powerful government is the exact opposite of the American ideal that men get their rights from God, not from government. That it is not first taken away. That man, if he is to be free, must restrict government to a very limited and negative role. We cannot restore the eternal ideals of government which made the United States the envy of the earth as long as we stay in the United Nations and by our membership subscribe to its totalitarian principles. On the other hand, American withdrawal from the United Nations would be a severe blow to worldwide communism and a tremendous boost to the cause of freedom. Surely the events so widely publicized in early 1963 will lead the American people to support the efforts of two of our best men in Congress, Bruce Alger and James Utt, who have bills before the House to get the United States out of the United Nations. Goodbye. God bless you. For a printed copy of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for $3.98. United Nations. 6 copies, $1.